Well, good afternoon, Alan Temple, and to everyone that is listening on this wonderful Thursday for a theological conversation. Actually, it is Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Thompson who allowed me to be the guest host this afternoon. So there is so much appreciation that goes out to her and especially her wonderful leadership. As I've stated before, when she's talked about the fact that some people have said, well, what are you doing with the church closed? This is an example of her saying the building may be closed, but the ministry of Jesus Christ goes on. So I give much appreciation to her. And I just wanted to throw that out. So here we are, Alan Temple, and to everyone listening, here's another wonderful Thursday theological conversation. And today, listen at this. We are so honored. We are so blessed to have no other than the renowned Reverend Dr. Mark Tyler. He is the pastor of the historic Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, the city that we call the city of brotherly love. He's no stranger to the Bay Area. He's a native of Oakland because he formerly pastored Brookings AME down on 73rd and Bancroft Avenue. He's a husband. He's a father. He's an activist. He is a talk show host. He is a national speaker. And in addition to his many degrees, including a PhD in educational leadership from Dayton, he is a documentary filmmaker. He has appeared with Dr. Henry Louis Skip Gates. We know that name on the genealogy and the African Americans on many rivers to cross. Dr. Tyler serves on numerous boards. And before we get into tonight's conversation, Dr. Tyler, we so much appreciate you and the time that you have taken out to be with us. I am aware that earlier, I believe you may have did a virtual funeral for a former member at Brookings. So we know that you may be a little tired, but you're ready for the cause tonight. So we just bless you for all that you do and particularly for your activism. Let's get started. Tonight, we're going to talk about the Black church, the struggles, the strengths, and relate that to some of the current events that are going on this afternoon. We know that people really miss gathering in the building. But as I stated, we have to be innovative and find a different approach to continuing ministry. Think about this. In a twinkling of an eye, the pandemic of COVID-19, it has changed everything for the church, not just the Black church, but churches in general. Churches had to change the way that they did ministry. And when the physical doors of the church closed, the question we had to wrestle with was how would we contextualize and continue ministry in the era of COVID-19? And indeed, we are in the midst of a pandemic. Members are scattered. We have many as Black people, the numerous pandemics, the pandemic of Black Lives Matters as it relates to police brutality. The fact that we have been hit harder than any other groups of people, and that is because there are some other underlying conditions that relate to that. We have experienced a higher mortality of death. There's unemployment. We've had to pray for those that have been out there on the battlefield, being activists. And so when I think about it and the Black church, this is not the first pandemic that we have faced. You know, I'm reminded theologically when I look back at this verse out of Matthew 16:18, Jesus told Peter, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail." Well, here we are in COVID-19, and no matter what people may think, look back at that verse and just know no matter what comes, no matter what goes, the gates of hell, and I call the pandemic hell, will not prevail. So before we hear from Dr. Mark, let me just lay a couple of foundations about the Black church, because it's also historical that we're looking at on these various hot topics. You know, we didn't start in a what they call a visible building. We started down in the hush harbors. We were a people that had to steal away. We had to use code words to gather the people. And that's where we were smart. We were savvy. We learned how to strategize our freedom. And this whole notion of the Black church being founded on freedom is what I want Dr. Mark to tell us about this afternoon, because truly there is great history in having a person of his stature stand in history as the pastor of Mother Bethel. So, Dr. Mark, talk to us about Mother Bethel and its genesis, how it started with Reverend Allen and Absalom Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, and thank you for those kind words of welcome, and certainly to Pastor Thompson in her absence. I'm hoping that I'll get a chance to see her before we're done here tonight with Theological Thursdays at the Temple. I kind of like that, the fact that you all have taken this and used this opportunity. You know, as I think about the history of the church, something that you said actually reminded me of a part of our past. And I know we're going to talk about the pandemic and what it's done to church later. But in many ways, Mother Bethel feels like we are going back to our original roots. So our congregation was founded in 1787 with the walkout from segregated pews at St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. A congregation that at one time welcomed Black worshipers. So the founding of Northern Free Black churches is slightly different than the description that you gave, which is accurate, of churches in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and all of those southern states where enslaved Blacks also had their own churches, but where those hush harbors, and they'd steal away at night to have church. Little different experience in the North with mostly free Blacks. Some were still enslaved, but were working their way through gradual emancipation in northern cities. And so when our church was founded, initially Blacks were drawn to Methodism because the founder of Methodism, John Wesley in England, was an avowed abolitionist. In fact, the last letter he dictated on his deathbed in London was to the abolitionist legislator, William Wilberforce, imploring him to use everything in his power to abolish slavery in England, which he ultimately did. So Blacks were naturally drawn to Methodism because of the founder. Blacks were allowed to worship freely. In fact, it was not uncommon, as I often have said in the past, to have an enslaved, African in worship with their owner in the worship service, and the enslaved African was the preacher for the worship service. Absolutely unheard of. So Richard Allen arrives in Philadelphia, 1786, joins St. George's Church and begins preaching the 5 a.m. worship service. Black members start to come out of the woodworks. The numbers begin to swell. And at first, it's all good for St. George's. Their church is growing. But now the fear is it's growing too fast. Blacks will soon outnumber us. They'll take over our church. And they institute the segregated pew. They push Black worshipers to the back. And when the back is not far enough, they build a gallery for them to stand on. You can't even sit anymore. And they're pushed all the way to the back. Ultimately, balconies are put in and Black worshipers are told to go upstairs. It's somewhere in that period of time that Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and others in a mass exodus walked out of St. George's Church to found what would become Mother Bethel AME Church, the first independent Black church in the country. And I make that distinction because you Baptist folk know well your history, that there were Black congregations that predated Mother Bethel in Savannah.
That's right.
But those were started with the help of white folk and who set them up for them. What sets Mother Bethel apart is that it is the first independent Black church that is started under Black control, which there's no model, there's no example that Richard Allen can look to as he's starting this out. And so many of the fights that led to the founding of our original congregation, we are still dealing with today. And I'm happy to talk about all of that, but I wanted to give a little context that we are really right back at our beginning place, because when we walked out, Richard Allen had nowhere to go. He said, we want to worship on our own vine and fig tree, but we had no building. So from 1787 to when he bought the land in 1791, and then got the first building erected in 1794, a 7-year period of time where there was a church, but there was no building. So we are accustomed to being able to worship and to be able to still serve as a congregation without a physical building. As I said to our members during the pandemic, this is not new. We're just returning to our roots, and maybe God wants to teach us something in this moment.
Right. For those that don't know, over your shoulder, Dr. Mark, it's actually a stamp with a photo of Reverend Allen back there. So for those that don't know, that's a picture of him. Let me just say something too about the Bay Area. We look at oftentimes as the Emancipation Proclamation as the beginning of slaves being set free. But you know what's phenomenal about the Bay Area, and I know that you know that, and some others out there that are listening in, is that even before the Emancipation Proclamation, we had Black churches in the Bay Area. We had Bethel AME, and that's another thing that's unique about the AME church. It's a connectional church, unlike Baptists, which are, autonomous. So we had Bethel, which is over in San Francisco. We had FAME, which was the first Black church. FAME, that acronym stands for the first, the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. We call it FAME. It was the first Black church, followed by Beth Eaton, which is the first Black Baptist church. Then we had another church in San Francisco, which was the Zion, the AME Zion. So you have all of these churches even before that, and they all came out of the struggle with the search for that optimum word, freedom, which is in many ways what we are still looking for now. So the one thing I want to say, and I want you to chime in on this, is that the Black church has been the foundation. They're almost connected, the Black church and the community. They come together. That has been the history. We can't necessarily say that may be the case now, but that's the background of it. Out of the Black church came schools, because here in California, as in other places, there was this racism and discrimination, that the first schools that Black children attended here in California was in the basement of the churches. Talk to us about, some of the other things, the strengths of the Black church.
Sure, certainly. So without question, in those early days, the Black church was everything. And today, those expectations seem to follow us, right? So even people who don't go to church, for example, expect the Black church to show up in places and to involve itself in things like the fight for education, the fight for healthcare, quality housing. I had a group of younger activists once, like in my face. This was a few years back, and we were just going back and forth. It's what activists do. And they were telling me about like the Black preachers who weren't there, and I'm saying to myself, and I said to them, like, why are you telling me about Black preachers who are not there when I've been here with you? You tell me where I've not shown up. And so one of them said something that was very illuminating, though, about the way people view the church. She said, "You're supposed to be here. What do you want? A cookie?" Right. But I said, now, here's a person, she doesn't go to church. She says she hates the church, has no use for the church. And yet she says to me, as a Black preacher, I'm supposed to be there. That expectation is not felt by white clergy colleagues. They can simply be the pastor. If they choose to get involved in social justice concerns, that's great, but nobody expects it. If somebody is shot by the police in our city, if there is a riot, if there's whatever, the expectation is Pastor Thompson is supposed to be there. She's got to be there. Pastor Burroughs from Brookings has to be there, and so there's a different kind of expectation, and it is rooted in the history that the Black church so very often had to carry all the extra burdens. So we're accustomed to not only having to worry about our sermon on Sunday, but also the social things. And I think, a lot of it, I think, is deeply biblical, right? I was reflecting just the other day. We were trying to help a family, tragic loss, 11-year-old child who's been a part of our congregation, suddenly passed on this week, and just gut wrenching. And so, everything stops while we tend to that family and help minister to them. On the same day, here we are. I'm on a town hall last night with city council and leaders from around the country, including Reverend Mike McBride from the Bay, trying to figure out what independent police oversight looks like and trying to push that demand into legislation. And so we have always had to manage the tension between priestly and prophetic. Again, exactly. We're like Elisha the prophet. 1 minute he is helping a widow save her sons from the creditors, which is just as important as dealing with the king who has lost his way and off fighting wars he should not fight. That, again, for us, it is deeply biblical, it's deeply historical. And I don't think as a Black congregation that you are truly living into what God has called us to be without being both of those things at the same time.
That's a powerful statement that you made, because the Black church walks on both sides of the street. There is the prophetic, there is the priestly. But when we look at the prophetic side, we go back how Jesus started his ministry, let's just say. And he gave a signal to those in the synagogue when he said, the infamous Luke 4:18 found it, reading from Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, the brokenhearted, and to set at liberty those that are in captivity. So that becomes the basis for a lot of how we model what Jesus did. We didn't come to sit around in the sanctuary. We came to be out among the people, to look at those that are disenfranchised, for those that are victims of the inequities of social justice and so forth. So it's a difficult walk that I'm going to say that the Black pastor has. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm a little perturbed when I hear people say the church is not doing anything. It's dead. In fact, we recall, and I think many people that are listening in, we recall that infamous article that Dr. Eddie Glaude wrote in the Huffington Post back, I believe it was 2010. But it was the way that particular heading went. He said that the Black church is dead, basically. And people said, what? So you had all of these ministers and other people saying, wait a minute. And he went on to try to, explain himself. I'm not taking up a stand on either way because I have my own opinions. What are your opinions about that particular article and how it relates to what's going on today?
Well, fortunately, we actually had Dr. Glaude come to Mother Bethel shortly after he wrote the article. He was with us during Holy Week, and so we wanted to take up the issue of the article. So like you're doing tonight with this theological conversation, we just invited him in, opened up the fellowship hall, and it was a great conversation. And, what he explained to us at that time, makes a lot of sense, that he wrote it to be provocative and to make the suggestion that the Black church back then, like you said, about 2010, was not fully, not to say that there weren't, isolated congregations that were certainly doing the kind of work. I mean, Allen Temple, you can't tell me of a time in the recent history where it has not been on the forefront, churches like yours, but that he was speaking more in general, that generally speaking, most of us have gotten around, kind of locked into a prosperity gospel ministry and other things. So, I mean, I was not offended because I knew he wasn't talking about me. And I kind of thought, as I heard the fallout, my mother, who's from Arkansas, who lives right there off of 98th and Golf Links to this day, she would say when I was growing up, a hit dog will holler every time. And so I figured a lot of the folks who were complaining were those hit dogs. And because, again, if you're doing the work, there's no need to stop and try to explain that you were there. People know that you were there.
Exactly.
And we have plenty of examples. We have colleagues all around the country who are doing phenomenal work. I think the question Eddie was asking, and I think it's a valid one, is, can more congregations be involved in this work, and should more? For the people, for example, I mean, right now this summer, everyone is fine with protest, but many of us have been out there consistently for decades now. And I mean, it's a shame that I can literally say for decades now, but it's the truth. And, typically it's not always popular, and it's not always, a big crowd that's going to be behind you when you're protesting at the police department or at City Hall. And yet we're often made to feel some kind of way about that by the people who benefit most from protest. And I ask people who have an issue with us taking up a cause, like, how is it that you get to work where you work or live where you live, and you send your children to schools? That was done by if you were Black, that means somebody protested for you to get the right to work at the post office or at a factory or to be on the police department, the things you take for granted today. So how can you knock activists and activist-minded congregations and clergy when you would not have what you have today if it had not been for those same people?
Oh, I agree there, and that's what, many people have to understand. There was a history before this pandemic. And even back when we look back at the 1960s and that whole phenomena of the civil rights era and how the church was the rallying point. That's where the prophetic side of the church really shined. And it was the place that people gathered. It was where we strategized. It was where we took off marching. You look at the Selma March and Bloody Sunday and so forth, but you look at the fact that it was the Black ministers. And I also want to really say women were they were in the background, but they were at the forefront of a lot of this change that came about. And I think maybe, Doc, one of the things that I grapple with, and I see maybe the Black church needs to think about teaching more of our history. You look at Asian people, and when those kids go to school, the regular public schools, but in the afternoon, they come to Asian school, and they are connected to their history. What's your thoughts on that as it relates to, maybe we wouldn't hear this racker if it wasn't for the fact that people really don't know their history.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you can get a people disconnected from their history, then you can pretty much do with them whatever you want. There's no surprise that enslavers of Africans did something that I don't know a precedent in history, because I think, slavery certainly was not new. European slavery of Africans and exporting African slaves. But what was new was the intentional cutting off of names, cutting off of language, cutting off of culture and history. So when folk tell us go back to Africa, I'm like, that would be nice, but where would we go, right? I mean, which tribe and all of these kind of things.
Exactly.
So, right. So, and we can see kind of the what has happened as a result of being cut off, right? And so you talk to some people, and a lot of Black folk in America literally think our history began as enslaved people. That is such a very small part of the history of African people that if you were to lay out the continuum of time, it wouldn't even register as a blip, those 300 or 400 years of our, sojourn in the Western Hemisphere. So when you really understand who we are, it gives you a sense of pride. And I think about it a lot now, not growing up, not knowing that history, running the streets of East Oakland, getting in trouble not far from Allen Temple, on the streets in 81st, below East 14th, as it was called back then. And all that trouble, and a lot of it was rooted in the fact that I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I had come from. I didn't even know my family's story, the story that I know now, that I can go back, with certainty to the early 1800s and point to 3 Black people in my family and people who were actually, writing and doing things. I mean, it gives you a sense of pride. And when you know that history and you know what you're connected to, it just makes you walk differently. Jewish folk do it very well with the Seder each year, the Passover Seder, when they sit down and the children they're involved in retelling the story. And I think that we need to think about those same kind of traditions for ourselves. At our family reunions, there should be a time where we stop and tell the family story. I mean, Dr. Taylor, half of the folk in Oakland don't even know how they got to Oakland. They don't, I did a funeral. I did the prayer at the funeral today and read the scripture and had some remarks at Brookins and virtually. And by the way, I was an associate pastor there, not the senior pastor, but it's my home church. But as I did the service where Gladys Lindsay did my contribution, 92 years old, came to Oakland by way of the Great Migration in 1943. My grandmother came from Arkansas in 1943, worked at Moore's Dry Dock. And my grandfather on my father's side came from Oklahoma, worked at Moore's Dry Dock. And all of these folk, so when we look at World War II, we think of it as a story of white men who went off and fought and made us free. They could not have done it without folk like my grandmother and my grandfather and Gladys Lindsay, who helped retrofit ships so that they would not be sunken by Japanese torpedoes in the Pacific. So they are every bit as much of a hero and a heroine as the folk who fought at Pearl Harbor. But we don't tell that story that way. So we need to understand there wouldn't be American history without Black folk. And there wouldn't be an America to celebrate and even fight over had Black folk not been a part of every single battle in this country's history.
I am so glad you brought that up. See, there's a connection with you and I, because my dad came out here from Louisiana first before, he sent for the family, and he landed a job at Moore's Dry Dock. And so I'm familiar with Moore's Dry Dock. It was one of those places where a lot of the our people were able to get work from it. It was for the war. So we benefited and able to come from the South. When we go back to World War I, it was the fact that the cotton fields were drying up. The pickers weren't there. We had World War I that brought a lot of Black people here to, the Pacific coast and other parts of the United States. But I want to touch on something since you brought that up, because I'm proud of the work that I did on writing the history of how churches got started in the Bay Area from 1849 through 1972. Someone said, why did you have to stop in 1972? I said, well, at some point, every book has an ending. Perhaps there'll be a part 2. But when I think about our people and the strength that we have and the faith that we have in God, and I think about, we came here, I said it like this: when they sounded the bell and they said you're free, where did we go? How did we get started? How do we leave the South and come out here and build institutions such as our Black church? And we started in living rooms. We morphed from Bible studies and things of that nature. And we went from tents to temples. We are a mighty people. And so when we look at young people who I want to have a conversation, not just a conversation, but to talk about our history. And I'll go back on something else that we were talking about earlier, and that is the place of the Black church, as Eddie Glaude talked about it. We know that if you put the Black church today against what it was back in the 60s, The black church wasn't a black church. That wasn't the name of it. Because, see, we have gone through identification, racial identification of who we are. Like you said, know who we are. Churches went from being called slave churches to colored churches to Negro churches to black churches. So when the Black Panther movement, or I should say just that whole Black Power movement, it was the Black Power movement that forced the Negro pastor to say, how are you going to get in on the movement? Everyone wasn't like, Martin Luther King. And so here you have the Negro pastor talking to the Black congregation because they had gotten on board. So we did a name change during that time. And we were so out front. And now, what's your thoughts on that as we are looking at what's going on and
Sure.
the collective prophetic voice of the Black church?
Well, I think that the church has to acknowledge that we have to share leadership in this moment, right? So historically, when you think back, who were the few educated Black people in a community, the people who literally could read, write, and do basic arithmetic were preachers. And you had to do all of those. You needed to read to be able to understand the Bible, then teach it to others. I mean, even the history of lining a hymn, right? We don't even stop to think about where that comes from. You stand up and it's like, we're going to sing Blessed Assurance, and you read the first verse and then you read the next one before people sing it. It's because the people in the pews could not read. And so the preacher so they were learning, as the hymn was lined to them, it was being fed to them. So now we're in a position where everyone is educated, has basic education. And there are oftentimes people in your congregations far exceed you as the pastor in education. And so we're in a moment now where when you think about who's going to lead this moment as the Black church, we think because it's always been us that it has to always be us by ourselves exclusively. But in today's world, folk are not waiting for the church. Now, If the church shows up, people will say, come on, let's lead this together. But I'm going to tell you, in 2014, after Ferguson, and I went to Ferguson with a group of clergy from around the country. And so when we got back to Philadelphia, we were organizing like you all were doing in Oakland. And I'll never forget the night that the district attorney in St. Louis was to make his announcement as to whether or not he would charge Darren Wilson for Mike Brown's death. And the entire country was waiting. You remember his mom was sitting on the car when they announced there would be no charges. You can never forget the way that she screamed. Yeah, it just pierced your soul. And so that night, our clergy group and lay folk were meeting next to City Hall in a congregation that is one of our congregations in our group, Power. We're connected to OCO. And so we had talked to the young folk who were going to meet us across the street at City Hall, and then we would march together. So that's over. We all pray in the church. We get up, we walk out, and we get to City Hall. Nobody's there. And we asked a couple of cops who were standing there, like, where are the young folk? They're like, that group that was here? I said, yeah. They said, they left about 20 minutes ago. So I said, they left. So we called one of our organizers who's kind of embedded with the folk. And I said, Patrice, where's the group? We're out here waiting. We're supposed to meet. She said, Reverend Tyler, the group is left. I said, you left? Where are you? She said, we're on 8th and Market. That's like 6 blocks away. I said, Patrice, tell them they need to wait for us. She said, Reverend Tyler, I can't make them wait. The group is moving. I said, Patrice, you all have to wait for us. She said, Reverend Tyler, the movement has left. Either catch up or we will talk to you tomorrow. And I said, it was such an eye-opening moment. And I looked at our group. I said, I guess we better catch up. And we took off. And luckily, we finally caught them. But Dr. Taylor, that would have never happened to a Dr. King or Ralph Abernathy or Fred Shuttlesworth or any of those folks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, because people would have said, you can't leave. The preacher's not here. These young folks said, we're mad, we're fired up, we're leaving. And if the preachers want to be with us, they got to catch up to us. that's different. And that is, I think, what makes this movement and moment different. Is not that folk won't work with you, but folk are saying, if our freedom and liberation depends on waiting on you to figure it out, then some of us in some cities would never have a movement, because many of these things are started by young folk who are anonymous up until the time they went to Twitter or Facebook and folks started following them. Yeah, it's quite a moment.
That is so true. That is so true. I look at young people. I look at this gray hair I have. I represent a different era, but I am so yoked to the way that young people think because of the movement that they are. And I'm going to say they're leading the movement right now. Black Lives Matter wasn't started in the church. Maybe that acronym, Black Lives Matter, we've always said lives matter, but they brought a different kind of forefront to the meaning. And perhaps when I look at the church now and look at the church then, there's kind of a separation between the young adults, well, I'll just say the youth, and older people. What do you think is really causing that now, that they don't feel as intimate with the church? Though, like you said, they attend colleges and they stand on the backs of people that have gone before.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of things. So for one, the generational divide has always been there, right? I mean, all one has to do is think about Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King. I mean, just that tension. Exactly. And Dr. King was in his 30s. I mean, you think they're talking about like a guy in his 80s or 90s, the way that Stokely and that group talked about the old men who won't let us lead, right? They were closer to being siblings than like father and son. And so that part's always kind of been there. But I think that there's a lot of suspicion about the church from the community that is unchurched. And some of it, I will say, is undeserved, but some of it is rightfully deserved, right? For a very long time, we have been more inclined to be institutional builders and only focused on those who come through our four walls. And so if you're not a part of our denomination, our association, a part of our convention, then it's not that we don't care about you, but we're building churches, so we go from one project to the next. We're taking care of our young people, getting them scholarships and getting them off to school, things that are important. But what about all the other children? And so for years, we have kind of moved in a way that when Jim Crow ended and people could spread out, we were no longer living in the same neighborhoods in West Philly and North Philly, or in Oakland's case, once you could like get up above MacArthur or Foothill into the, you start getting into the hills, all of a sudden you could forget about the folk, on A and B and D and C and D streets. Right. And so that kind of crept into the church as well. Yeah. So I think that in a lot of ways we broke faith with the community, and our churches became places that we locked up when we left to keep them safe from these strangers in the neighborhood who look like us, but we didn't really. Our crowd is the crowd that drives in on Sunday or on Monday night or Tuesday night for a meeting, and then we drive away. And then we wonder why the community, has a feeling about us. Now, the other thing, and I think most importantly, Black Lives Matter was started by three, Black women who are lesbian. And so many of the young folk who followed, it started using the term Black Lives Matter in the very beginning, had a very different idea about human sexuality than, many folk who are in the traditional Black church. And so their feeling is that if everybody can't, be a part of leadership in the movement, so that's straight people, that's gay people, that's trans people, then they don't want to, they don't want to be in a space where folk have to stay outside. And that has been an issue for a lot of Black pastors. Let's be frank about it. And so I think that's also been a part of the tension in this current movement, not as much now in 2020, but certainly 6 years ago. And so I think right now people are beginning to kind of move past some of that. And I've seen a lot of my clergy colleagues who may not be there on issues like same gender marriage, but at the same time can roll with anybody when it comes to protesting and demonstrating. Some bridges have been built in the last 6 years, but there's still a wide divide. And I think that drives a lot of the tension between folk in the movement today and what we know is traditionally the Black church.
Yeah, you're so right on that. And then when we look back and we were talking about how the community itself, it's not always about individuals, but so much so. But then we start to look at gentrification and how that has impacted, the effectiveness of the church. Black people started to move out of the core urban area and move into other places where they too wanted a better life, so to speak. That's the way it was looked at. And we cruise in on Sunday, and the young people that are left there are saying, wait a minute, where are you throughout the week? Black churches nowadays are challenged based on gentrification because the community that they once served, they're scattered. They're scattered. So there's this whole notion of our members are not there. The finances are not there. It weakens the ability of the church economically itself. I mean, when you have a congregation that is economically deprived, they aren't able to put the kind of money to sustain the church that it was. So gentrification has certainly impacted us. But I've noticed, what I've noticed, Dr. Tyler, is that a lot of churches here in Oakland are now sharing their space with other congregations that have moved, other people that have moved in. In the afternoon, somewhere around 2:00, the banner changes, and now we have Baptista Iglesia. We'll have, Asian churches. Is that happening there in Philly as much?
Sure, it's happening all over the East Coast. To your point, as new arrivals come in and fill these neighborhoods, and my congregation, Mother Bethel, sits at ground zero for Philadelphia's gentrification. I mean, it is it's like the test, right? So the neighborhood that W.E.B. Du Bois spent his time, that developed the Philadelphia Negro and souls of Black folk in his early writings. Yeah. This neighborhood now, the starting price to move in is $1 million. And so there's not a whole lot of, Black families in our particular neighborhood right now. But gentrification has certainly had an impact in Philadelphia. It's had an impact everywhere. And so churches are trying to struggle to find ways to stay open and to stay present. A good friend of mine who pastors in Washington, D.C., Reverend Darrell Kearney, their congregation has opened up to a Latinx congregation. And a funny thing has happened. So, I think they did it initially like most churches. It's a financial decision, right? We don't need the church during this time of the day. We got all this empty space, and that's what they started to do. But they have developed, these deep ties. So I was there for a weekend, just passing through D.C. There was a Saturday afternoon. They were doing a cookout at the church, and so both congregations were there. So he's there with this Latinx pastor, and the members are flowing together. They're eating together. The kids are playing together, and so the beauty of it is that it's now turning into ministry, and it's not just this financial piece. And I think that's a challenge for us, right? As Black folk, do we always play well with others in this space? Probably not, right? Because we kind of have this very exclusive idea about what church is, and we have our way of worshiping, and we don't want to let anybody else. Now, others are probably the same way. I can only speak from my experience. But to watch his example, in fact, I encouraged him to write an article about it, which he did, which was published in our AME newspaper. And I do think it is a model for many of us to begin to think about, are we really being good stewards with the physical buildings that we have? And is there more that we can do with the space? So, yeah, I just think that's one of the things that's going to probably be a trend moving forward.
Yeah. We're certainly proud here at Allen Temple under the leadership of Reverend Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr., we finally call him Pastor E, is that years back when it really began to change, the neighborhood began to change toward a lot of Hispanic people moving in. It was another Deacon Aguilar and Reverend Aguilar, and there were some others. They got together and they came up, I shouldn't say we, with a church, the Allen Temple Batista Iglesia Church, which is alive and well. And Pastor Hurtado, you talked about outreach. He's even built some churches, in El Salvador and other places. So it's one church, but they serve, a different body of people. So we found the need, and we have strengthened ourselves as a church in that particular area. Let me touch on a theological subject of, I think about this whole notion of when we talk about a new wine and old wine skins and that whole thing. And the COVID-19 church is really like the new wine, because the building, we're not in the building. And so if we were to look at a metaphor and contextualize this text, the old wineskins are akin to the doors of the brick and mortar church, as I've stated. The Bible tells us if you pour new wine into old wineskins, the old wineskins will burst. And in this season of COVID, we can't get into the old way, meeting in the brick and mortar building, but the ministry of Jesus Christ must go on. Talk to us about this old and this new way, like you said, continually doing God's work in a season of pandemic. We call it COVID-19, but I don't want to rain on the parade, but there's going to be a COVID-22. So
sure, yeah.
Talk to us, Dr. Mark.
Yeah, well, so, right. It's so this season for the church has been one that has severely tested it. Mm-hmm. And so churches are I don't think anybody's going to come out the same, the way that you were. The way that you went in, you will not be the same. My prediction is you will either be greatly diminished or greatly enhanced.
Yes.
So the churches that have been early adapters to change, right? When the shutdown happened, who said, I don't know about this 2 weeks thing. Let's just act like we ain't ever going to be back in the building and start assembling the church in a digital format. So those of us who were already live streaming, it was about how do we make it better? How do we, shorten the service, make it more compact, make it more portable, make it easier for members to access, make sure our giving opportunities are up to date and up to stuff. And let's start migrating meetings over to Zoom. Let's start moving Bible studies over to Zoom. Our biggest Bible study had been on Zoom for a full year leading up to it. So it was easy. So it was like, okay, you all teach the Wednesday Bible study and teach the Sunday school how to do it, and sure enough, after 2 weeks, we all realized, oh God, this is going to be maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8. There were still people, though. There were still congregations and pastors who were sitting there waiting for it to come back. And so 2 months in, had not done anything. They were maybe doing conference calls and things like that. And I'm thinking to myself, like, look, you may not get back in the building this year. And folk were telling me then 2 months ago, that's crazy. This will be over by the end of the summer. And what are we saying now? Everything, in Philadelphia, they have just canceled all outside and indoor activities of 50 over until the end of February.
Ooh,
as of now.
February of 2020?
February 21.
21. Wow.
A full year. And so our congregation story probably mirrors, I haven't had a chance to talk to your pastor, but I've been watching her. So I would imagine that your story is a lot like ours. Our attendance is up. Our giving is up. So the same giving period for the last for this 4 months last year, we are so far ahead of where we were last year. I can't even begin to explain it to you. And now you can see who's at worship on Facebook, right?
Exactly.
And who's calling into the conference call line. So folk who were before this once or twice a month worshipers are worshiping every Sunday. And if they can't make it on Sunday morning, they tune in whenever they want and treat the service like on demand, like it's Netflix or Hulu.
Exactly.
And so, and it's wonderful. They got the option. They're sharing it, and we have people visiting. I can't tell you, every Sunday, it's an international experience. Folk are chiming in from Cape Town, from India, from throughout the Caribbean, all over the United States. And, you know, it's Mother Bethel, so we're the mother church for everyone else. So folk are naturally inclined to see what we're doing. But, you know, that's not enough to keep people. And so, again, I just simply say that for us, it has been more upside than downside. We certainly would prefer to be in the building with one another and to be in that kind of setting inside. But we have discovered that we are still the church. And in some ways, we are more the church now than we were before the pandemic. And so, you know, my heart goes out, though, to those pastors who are just, that kind of reminds you of the book, Who Moved My Cheese? I know you're familiar with that book. It's an old business
Who Moved My
book.
Cheese, right. Navigating.
Yeah, so you remember, so, you know, Skimp and Scurry took off and, you know, they found new cheese quickly. Him and Hall decided that they were going to wait for the cheese to return, which never happened.
Didn't happen.
Right. And so I say to folk, look, the old cheese, whatever the church used to be, forget it. It's gone. Because even next year, my folk who are elderly have to think about their health and are probably going to choose to stay at home, with the exception of big occasions and first Sunday for communion. And that's probably a good decision. And we will probably be more of a hybrid than anything else for the next several years going forward.
Hey, you know, it makes it real, Dr. Mark, because what did Jesus say? On this rock, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail. The pandemic and COVID-19 will not get us down. But I admire a pastor like yourself, definitely our pastor, Pastor Jackie, who has, you know, been innovative and continually to do the ministry of Jesus Christ. If we really look at the meaning of the church is the individual. We have to get out of the building. Jesus never hung around the building. He was out among the people. So we have, like your church, Allen Temple, I'm so proud of the leadership of Dr. Thompson, because this whole notion of we're still feeding people. Our church is a testing site for COVID-19. We are continuing a Sunday service. The Bible classes are continually going forward. The finances has not been interrupted, and we're reaching more people. Right now, more people are watching this program than they would if we simply had Thursday night Bible class. That probably just wouldn't be the case. So it's a new day. It has to be some new wine in these new wine skins, if we use that metaphor. And I just think that the work of the church is even more phenomenal now. If we look at the positive side and not have those days of nostalgia when we want to go back to the building. When I look at our time, we're almost there. And before I close out, I want to say a word and then have you close us out with a benediction of hope. I know you're familiar with Vincent Harton's book, There Is a River. You know, that's a phenomenal book. Let me quote something from him. He says this: we may sense that the river of Black struggle is people, but it is also the hope, the movement, the transformative power that humans create and that create them and makes them new persons. We Black people are the river. The river is us. That's the end of that quote. And his words remind me of the prophet Amos, who said, let justice roll down like waters and as righteousness as a mighty stream flowing. We, the people right now, we represent justice. Of course, we are dealing with people that are shut in, but we have to remember, and that's where the word of hope comes in. God is with you now, wherever you are. It's not the building, it is the people. And so I'm encouraging people to feel strengthened in this moment in time. Dr. Tyler, close us out in a benediction of hope, however the Lord leads you.
Well, listen, I want to thank you and thank Pastor Thompson for the opportunity for being here, as well as my fellow dragon from O'Dowd days, Reverend Williams, and in the background, making sure all the tech is right. I think I'll close us out with a quote from Howard Thurman.
All right.
It just seems appropriate. East Coast to the Bay Area. But Thurman says, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And so with that, I say to those who are listening, do likewise and come alive, and the world around you will do so as well. Thank you so much for having me. God bless.
Thank you so much for your time. God bless you. God bless Mother Bethel. And to you that are listening in, God bless you. And for now, good night.